Hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Leson, President of the National Council of Women of Canada Education Fund, and it is a pleasure to welcome each of you to this important conversation with Marie-Josée Houle, the Federal Housing Advocate. This event is bringing together members of our councils of women with other local, provincial, and national organizations that share our concerns, as well as many community activists, advocates, and interested individuals from across Canada. As we continue the journey toward true reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, it is my privilege to introduce my friend Beverly Bowe, a Status Cree Assiniboine Métis woman. Beverly is an activist, advocate, leader, teacher, role model, and mentor in our community, whose roles include active involvement with the Prince Albert Council of Women and facilitating and hosting many traditional events, along with founding Mothers on Trial here in Prince Albert. Bev was honored with a priory vote of thanks from the Governor General of Canada for her many years as a volunteer and trainer with St. John Ambulance. Personally, Bev has chosen to share with us that she has been clean and sober for many years, due to her commitment to following the Red Road. She is currently putting to good use her Bachelor of Social Work degree as an instructor with the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology. Bev is traveling today and is joining us from the road. Beverly.
Good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon in some locations. I'm really honored to be here and asked to do this. So I'll do the prayer. I humbly come to you today and warmly extend my hand to all who are gathered here. I pray to the Creator, the pipe, grandmothers and grandfathers in the four directions. I pray for a good and positive outcome for this gathering today, that women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse peoples are safe and met, and needs are met in all ways. I ask that all gathered here and all governments to ensure that the needs of all inhabitants of Mother Earth are met in a good way, and that the work is not only words, but actions. I pray for blessings for all on this full grandmother Strawberry Moon Day, as she is kind and loving and hears our prayers, all my relations.
Beverly, thank you. To honor you joining us here today with your presence and your prayer, I have placed tobacco on the east side of the tree by the missing and murdered Indigenous women's monument on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River in Prince Albert. As you have shared, the east is the direction of new beginnings and vision. May it ever be so. Thank you. I now invite our Education Fund Secretary, Carol Schweitzer, to share our land acknowledgement.
As we begin our work today, let us acknowledge and respect the Indigenous peoples of all the lands on which we have presence. Let us reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to the protection of the land on which we each call home. Let us acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and let us consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
Thank you, Carol. Our EF Treasurer, Karen Monin-Dempsey, will now be pleased to share with you a bit about our organization and our work on the common program titled Human is a Human Right.
Thanks, Patricia.
Housing is a human right.
Thanks, Patricia. The NCWC, Education Fund, was established as a charitable corporation in 2001. Although we often work on events programs with the National Council of Women, the NCWC Education Fund is a totally separate legal entity with its own bylaws and governance. Our mission statement is to provide research and public education regarding the environmental, social, mental, physical, and health needs of women, families, and societies. Over the years, we have explored an amazing variety of important topics and tapped into a wealth of internal and external expertise. Some of our past programs have been Young Women and Violence Prevention, Securing Our Future, which entailed the economics of later life action plans and curricula developed to help young women plan for a healthy economic future. Canada's Water. Those programs included a panel re water shortages, impacts of mega dams, drought, mining, and the need for a national water strategy. The Water Energy Connection Program projects entailed programs re the Great Lakes, nuclear, soft water / energy paths, connections projects, programs re the Great Lakes, and climate. This project was funded by the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation and included public meetings, newsletters, a website, and across Canada survey on water energy use and public opinion on government energy and water policies. Women and mental health. And the last one, before our current project, before our current common program, was listening to, learning from, and acting on the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Women and Girls Commission. For the past 2 years, our focus has been directed to the topic, Housing is a Human Right. The following events are free programs which we brought to Canadians through easily accessed webinars. In November 2023, Kate Birkenholder Harris, the Executive Director of the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa, spoke to Ending Homelessness 101, How We Get There. In April 2024, we held a webinar on social housing and human rights, Mobilizing for Change, with guest speaker Kirsten Burness, a coordinator of the National Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign, Director of Policy Advocacy at West Central Women's Resource in Winnipeg, and chair of the Provincial Working Group, Manitoba's Right to Housing Coalition Center. In June 2024, we held a webinar with special guest speaker Ricardo Tranjan from Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ottawa. This focused on multifaceted issues facing our underhoused and unhoused population re our current housing system, referencing his book, The Tenant Class. On our November 2024 webinar was entitled Housing, Our Most Vulnerable, One Size Does Not Fit All, with panelist Chief Brendan Mitchell, Regional Chief for Newfoundland with the Assembly of First Nations, Tim Richter, President and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and Donna Brooks, CEO of the Prince Albert YWCA. And our moderator was Stephanie Langenegger, host of the morning edition on CBC Saskatchewan. And of course, today we are happy to bring you Ms. Houle. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Gracia Janes, past president of the NCWC Education Fund, has the privilege of introducing our guest speaker. Gracia.
Yes, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Ms. Houle, I should say. I've been working on the name for quite a while now. She advised us wisely and helped us put together her wonderful information gathering and report to the government, helped us put together our latest policy, an emergency policy last year on housing as a human right. It was just wonderful work. Ms. Houle was appointed as Canada's first federal housing advocate in February 2022, marking a new chapter in a career defined by her work in the affordable housing and homelessness sector. She was reappointed for a second 3-year term ending in February 2028. Ms. Houle is an experienced leader who is recognized by her community activism, expertise in human rights, and extensive knowledge of the housing and homelessness system. Prior to her appointment as Canada's first federal housing advocate, she has held a number of roles that informed her broad experience, including frontline work in housing co-ops, consulting and project management for affordable housing development, bylaw review, housing-related research projects, developing educational programs for housing co-ops and nonprofits, and senior leadership roles. A supporter and amplifier of marginalized voices, Ms. Houle promotes respectful and inclusive dialogue, creating a space for disadvantaged people to be heard, and applies an intersectional and anti-racism lens to her advocacy work. She has liaised with Indigenous housing providers, developers, and tenant support organizations to devise ways to be a better ally, support their work, and amplify their voices. From 2003 to 2010, she celebrated her dual cultural roots as a professional singer, songwriter, accordionist, and bassist. Anyway, she played bass. She became the go-to accordion player for many Canadian acts, recorded 2 solo albums, and toured relentlessly from one coast to the other, to Paris, to Vienna, Oslo, and beyond. Please join us in welcoming her. Thank you.
Wow, who is this person? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Miigwech, for that introduction, and to the National Council of Women of Canada for inviting me to speak today. And thank you especially to Beverly for being on the road, but still taking the time to open this session really in a good way. For anyone who can't see me, I'm a white woman with dark wavy hair. Je tiens à reconnaître que j'ai le privilège de m'adresser à vous depuis le territoire traditionnel et non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, dont la présence sur ces terres remonte à des temps ancestraux. Et et parce que ce forum se tient virtuellement, je tiens également à rendre hommage aux territoires ancestraux et non cédés de toutes les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis d'un océan à l'autre qui considèrent ce territoire comme leur chez-soi. So I'd like to acknowledge the gift of speaking with you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. And since this is a virtual forum, I'd also like to honor the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis from coast to coast to coast that call this land home. I make this land acknowledgement while, as we speak, the land is burning in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and many other places, and the thousands of people that have been displaced. These are devastating losses for families and communities, and to precious and meaningful cultural centers, some of which I've visited. So I want to extend my condolences to everyone affected. And I also want to emphasize that the circumstances, unfortunately, not new. Indigenous communities are being the hardest hit by the compounding climate and housing crises. And I met with the Assembly of First Nations this week to discuss priorities and how I can best advocate and monitor from a systemic perspective. This crisis is not just when the fires burn, but it is advocating for preventative measures and resources, and of course, the long process afterwards of healing and rebuilding lives and communities. So my remarks today will touch on 4 key areas. First, I'm going to discuss my role and my mandate and how you can interact with my office. Second, I'd like to offer some thoughts on human rights-based vision and legal frameworks that Canada is required to meet to respect the right to housing. Third, I will discuss some of the reviews of systemic issues that we've undertaken, and more specifically, the NAHA review panel that's underway on the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women and gender diverse people. And lastly, I will offer some suggested causes, knowledge, and actions needed to end gendered homelessness so that every person we're speaking about today can live in dignity and where their right to adequate housing is met. So to begin, I'm here today in my role as Canada's first federal housing advocate. However, I also bring my own lived experience of poverty, displacement, geographic marginalization, and housing precarity to this work. Lived experience of homelessness and housing precarity is key to the work we do, and we want to recommend system-wide solutions to governments
that truly represent the lived and living experiences of rights holders who are being disadvantaged by housing laws, policies, and programs. And I'm here to make sure that their voices reach decision makers. So as federal housing advocate, it's part of my job to hold all levels of government to account for the commitment to upholding the right to adequate housing as enshrined in the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act and international law. And I don't represent a government ministry. I'm a nonpartisan, independent watchdog and advocate. So my role includes several functions, from engaging with and receiving submissions from rights holders and organizations, to conducting advocate-led reviews and research, to monitoring the right to housing and the National Housing Strategy. So all of the work we do is focused on systemic issues. Everything we hear from rights holders helps shape the recommendations I make to the federal minister responsible for housing. And because housing is shared jurisdiction in Canada and every government has a role to play, I also name other levels of government in my recommendations. So as I mentioned, engaging with rights holders and civil society is important to the work we do, and I do welcome you to interact with our office and our work. And here's some ways to get involved and join us in advocating for the right to housing. Your organization can align with the human rights-based principles and approaches and frame your research and policy recommendations using this lens. And you can share relevant reports with us on systemic issues and vice versa. And I encourage you to visit the Canadian Human Rights Commission website or the Homeless Hub website, which includes a dedicated page with links to our research, reviews, and reports that you may want to leverage in your advocacy work. And your organization can make a submission to my office regarding a systemic housing issue. And I can write letters of support or raise issues with different levels of government after you've exhausted your advocacy efforts and maybe not seeing any response or action. So you can participate in review panels. The review on the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women and gender diverse people will be live streamed over the next few weeks. And I also encourage you to connect with other existing networks also working on the right to adequate housing across the country. And some of these partners include the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network, the National Right to Housing Network, and other advocacy organizations. Because it really takes all of us working together to push for the outcomes that we all want to see. Next, I'm going to offer some thoughts on a vision for safe, adequate, and affordable housing and homelessness policies and the legal frameworks that Canada is required to meet to respect the right to housing. The way forward to ensure that no one is left behind is through a human rights lens and human rights-based approach, which includes Indigenous rights and the active participation of lived experts in policies and laws affecting them. So in 1976, Canada signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Right, which recognizes the right to adequate housing and later enshrined in the right enshrined this right into law in the 2019 National Housing Strategies Act. And first and foremost, the right to housing is about human dignity. It means that everyone should have access to adequate housing that meets their needs without discrimination. And the human right to adequate housing means that everyone has a right to housing that meets a set of basic interconnected conditions, including security of tenure, affordability, habitability, including enough bedrooms for the occupants, and it has to be in good repair, accessibility, location, cultural adequacy, and access to services and infrastructure. And some of the Indigenous engagement participants we met with offered an expansion of this definition, including Indigenous women's inherent right to exist on their homelands, safety and self-determination, and a place for the expression of and continuance of cultural identity. So when we advocate from a human rights-based approach, we recognize how human rights are interrelated in important ways. The right to housing is linked to so many other human rights, including Indigenous rights and the right to health, employment, and education. Those are just examples, because really, how can we say healthy if our house is mold ridden or infested with vermin? And how do we find stable employment without safe and adequate housing? And how does a young student study for exams if their house is overcrowded? So the right to housing also has important gendered connections, such as the security of the person and protection of the family. And a rights-based vision relies on the right to live free from discrimination and harassment, which is raised frequently by rights holders during our engagement sessions with them. So this vision recognizes that when we align international and domestic human rights law, the right to housing, and the meaningful contribution of the lived experiences of women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, we can create housing policy that respects human dignity and ensures better outcomes for everyone. So this vision also requires that government, they need to live up to their human rights commitments and to take an active whole of government approach to these obligations. The federal government can show leadership on a rights-based approach through its national housing strategy and through many of its policies and approaches. Furthermore, the inclusion of gender-based analysis plus framework on the monitoring and reporting of the national housing strategy really is essential to build on and to advance the right to housing. All levels of government in Canada are required to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to housing. And international human rights treaties and obligations apply equally at federal, provincial, and territorial level. So I'm now going to turn to the topic of systemic reviews with a focus on the review currently underway. In the short time that my office has been running, I've conducted extensive engagement and research on several important systemic housing issues facing people from coast to coast to coast, including the financialization of purpose-built rental and long-term care, encampments, and now gendered homelessness. So I'm going to provide some more information on encampments and financialization during our discussion, as I know you had some question related to those topics. But for now, I'm going to focus on the work we've done related to gendered homelessness and the review underway by the National Housing Council. The second systemic issue I referred to the National Housing Council was for the review of gendered homelessness. And this review is now underway and has been named NEHA. So NEHA is the Ganyakan Mohawk word that describes a way of life that is open, peaceful, and supportive and healing. NEHA is a series of dialogues that engage women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse participants on their vision and solutions related to the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing. And the request for this review was based on submissions to my office made by the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm going to refer to these as the networks. And the request was based on the failure of the federal government to prevent and eliminate homelessness amongst women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people, and particularly Indigenous women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. I received 124 submissions from women and gender diverse individuals who've experienced homelessness, and 10 other submissions from organizations focused on gendered homelessness. And my office supported the lead submitters to undertake reports and conduct a number of engagements in preparation for this review. So in addition to the networks, we partnered with the Native Women's Association of Canada to engage with Indigenous, two-spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people on the barriers to their right to housing. We commissioned a report by Transpulse Canada on the housing barriers among trans and non-binary adults in Canada, We worked with researchers to create tools for participation, and we were guided by Two-Spirit, Trans, and Gender Diverse advisory with lived and professional experience related to homelessness and housing precarity. And lastly, I've spoken directly with rights holders and service providers about gendered homelessness from coast to coast to coast during my engagements and systemic reviews, including during my visits to British Columbia, Inuit communities in Nunavut and Nunatsiavut, and Métis communities in Saskatchewan, in the context of my review of homeless encampments and through the research and engagement related to intersections of gendered homelessness and disability. The public portion of the NEHA dialogue will be kicked off next week on June 16th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be presenting along with our network partners, and I encourage everyone to listen in to the dialogue. So you can find the links on the NEHA website. And so now I want to dive into the topic of gendered homelessness and the state of housing for women and gender diverse people in Canada. As the National Council of Women of Canada, I'm sure this topic, as I've heard from the introduction, it really does align closely with your knowledge base and advocacy work. And what I've heard from rights holders really is that they know what the solutions are for them to be adequately and safely housed. So part of my work is to amplify these solutions to decision makers. The causes of gendered homelessness are systemic. Personal experience and knowledge surfaced through our research and engagement identified important themes rooted in colonialism, policy definitions, poverty, discrimination, violence, and the failure to apply human rights-based approach to housing. And through engagements with the Native Women's Association of Canada, the National Indigenous Women's Homelessness Network, and visits to Inuit and Métis communities, I heard how the loss of land, underinvestment, and lack of Indigenous self-determination have driven homelessness and housing insecurity. Canada must transform colonial laws, policies, and programs that contribute to homelessness among Indigenous women and Two-Spirit, Trans, and gender diverse people. For example, this needs to be done by upholding treaty commitments and fully implement the Declarations Act, including the right to compensation in land and eliminating gender discrimination in determination of status and land tenure. By respecting self-determined women and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people-led housing and services on and off community and in urban, rural, and northern communities, and by enabling a range of housing tenures and forms to meet the diverse needs and aspirations of Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. And this includes cooperatives, land trusts, and other forms of collective ownership alongside individual rental tenure and ownerships, and other recommendations raised in my written submission. You know, how we define homelessness matters. Hidden homelessness, like couch surfing and staying in temporary arrangements, is common for women and gender diverse people, but it's often excluded from official data. And further, affordability definitions based on average rents exclude those with the lowest incomes. And in discussions with Statistics Canada and the National Housing Council, I emphasize that fewer than 5% of the National Housing Strategy units are affordable for those with the lowest incomes and in poor housing need. So we need policy to better reflect women and gender diverse people's experiences of homelessness, data needs, and income levels, building on existing gender-based analysis plus framework. You know, definitions of affordability must be based on actual income levels, not just on average incomes. And we need disaggregated data that's driven by and serves women and gender diverse people. And this will support decision-making to improve outcomes. And from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and others, we heard that most emergency shelters don't meet the needs of women, Two-Spirit, Trans, and gender diverse people. And in many regions of the country, no inclusive or gender specific options exist at all. Two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people must lead the development of safe and adequate shelters across the country. Even if shelters have gender inclusive policies, other residents may discriminate, leaving two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people more likely to end up in encampments. However, I do want to be clear that adequate housing is the goal, not shelters. Certainly not shelters, that end up being a semi-permanent place to live. So Canada's over-reliance on the private market, poverty, and persistent gendered wage gaps are also part of the problem. As stated earlier, housing is being treated as a commodity and financial asset to park wealth, and it's not treated as a human right or a place to live for people of all income levels. And the financialization of housing is accelerating the loss of affordable purpose-built rental units. And non-market housing accounts for just 3.5% of Canada's housing stock, which is much lower than many other Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. So the Pay Equity Commissioner here at the Human Rights Commission points out that gendered wage gaps, especially for Indigenous, racialized, disabled, and gender diverse people, have a negative impact on the right to affordable housing. And without adequate incomes, housing remains out of reach. And there needs to be continued support from the federal government to support legislation, policies, and programs to contribute to efforts to address the gender wage gap and promote income equality. So I'm pressing the federal government to engage with provinces and territories to ensure consistency on the gender wage gap and raise social, including disability. The assistant rates, they're additional, these are additional policy areas for advocacy. Positively, the newly elected government has made a commitment to double nonprofit and community housing. But according to research conducted by my office, a long-term target of 20% non-market housing is required to address the significant gaps in affordable housing. Discrimination, especially at the intersections of indigeneity, gender identity, disability, and poverty, was consistently raised in roundtables and during my visits to places like Nunavut and Happy Valley Goose Bay. Landlords can and do refuse tenants based on income, race, disability, or perceived risk. And I'd also like to highlight discrimination due to poverty, lack of employment, or housing status, including homelessness, known as social condition. So while social condition with varying definitions is present in some provincial and territorial legislation, like for example, Manitoba's includes housing status, it's not yet reflected in the Canadian Human Rights Act. But many of us believe that this needs to change. And extending discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act to include social condition as a protected ground really is the next frontier of human rights, and we need Canada to be a leader in it. The federal ombudsman for victims of crime shared cases where survivors of domestic violence or of violence in general remain trapped in unsafe housing because leaving would mean homelessness or a loss of custody of their children. And they also shared how young women seeking safety away from a violent partner can meet barriers or end up alone on the street due to subsidized housing wait lists or probation rules. And these structural gaps force people to choose between safety and shelter. So not being able to secure housing often results in stigma and criminalization, exposure to gender-based violence, human trafficking, and exploitation, detrimental physical and mental health issues, and child apprehension and family separation, just to name a few examples. And these drivers of homelessness and housing precarity, they don't exist in isolation. They interact and compound, leaving women and gender diverse people at the margins without safety, security, or dignity. And so this brings me back to my main point. Homelessness among women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people is a violation of human rights and Indigenous rights. And therefore, I'll be asking the NEHA panel to press the federal government to urgently adopt an adequately resourced human rights-based plan to eliminate homelessness among women and gender diverse people within a specific time frame. Alors, malheureusement, je ne pourrais pas aborder aujourd'hui l'ensemble des recommandations que nous avons posées, mais je vous encourage vivement à lire l'observation et à suivre la diffusion en direct le 16 juin. Vous avez un aperçu aujourd'hui de certaines informations qui seront révisées ou reprises, mais les renseignements supplémentaires sont également présentés par nos partenaires de mobilisation et de personnes ayant une expérience vécue de l'itinérance et de la précarité en matière de logement. So unfortunately today I won't be able to speak to all of the recommended actions that we put forth. But I do encourage you to read the submission and listen to the live stream on June 16th. So you've had a sneak peek today so some of the information that I'll be giving on June 16th will be the same, but there will be additional information provided by our engagement partners and people with lived experience of homelessness and housing precarity. So on that note, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I want to emphasize the importance of these mechanisms to review issues of a systemic nature. They provide access to justice for rights holders, which is an essential part of a healthy democracy. So I'm very interested to hear from all of you and how we can work together to advocate for better housing outcomes for everyone. Thank you.
Pardon me. Thank you so much for offering to take our questions today. And I encourage everyone who's attending to please put them in the chat box. Brenda and Penny, if you would keep an eye on the chat box. And we did have several that were sent in via email. So if we could start with them, we'd appreciate that. Our first question was from Ontario. And in February of 2023, you launched a formal review on homeless encampments that focused on understanding the daily struggles of the people living in homeless encampments and identifying systemic solutions to address the factors that lead to the establishment of such encampments. Could you please give us an update on your review and recommendations?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Homeless encampments really are the most visibly egregious and violation of the right to adequate housing. So encampments, they're not safe or a sustainable solution for housing, and encampment residents are at dire risk of harm due to government's failure to provide the necessities of life and services needed to protect their physical and mental health. And people living in encampments have often faced discrimination linked to racism, sexism, ableism, and the legacy of colonialism. So First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are disproportionately overrepresented among those living in encampments. So many social services and shelters are at maximum capacity or are not appropriate for the individual needs or circumstances of people experiencing homelessness, including two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people. So I conducted a review focused on understanding the daily struggles of people living in homeless encampments and identifying systemic solutions to address them. And the review was guided by the principles of a human rights-based approach, namely participation of rights holders themselves. So we worked with partners across the country to collect testimony from people living in encampments. And I met with encampment residents and local community advocates in Montreal, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Prince George, Toronto, and Calgary. And I also received submissions online from 313 people with lived experience in encampments, and another 53 advocates, organizations, and municipalities shared their perspectives and observations. So we also engaged with civil society organizations, Indigenous governments, and experts in human rights and housing. And as the question mentioned, I released my report on February 13th in 2024. Published my final report, which included findings and recommendations directed at the federal minister responsible for housing, other federal ministers, and provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. So, as a little plug, I encourage everyone to read the report. But, my primary recommendation was that the federal government establish a national encampments response plan that would ensure access to basic necessities for people living in encampments, to help them live in dignity, such as clean water, sanitation, food, heating and cooling, accessible supports, healthcare, and harm reduction, to include a call to end forced evictions of encampments, that make people more unsafe, and put in place, alternatives that are designed to follow meaningful engagements with encampment residents, and then to de-emphasize the role of police and bylaw officers, to coordinate an all-of-government response and provide supports to municipalities, to respect the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to determine, develop, and administer programs and services related to housing and homelessness, and of course, offer meaningful housing as soon as possible, and not just more shelter spaces. So to actually get to the question, I'm going to say I was pleased that the federal government set aside $250 million in budget of 24 for human rights-based encampment responses, which can be matched by the provinces and territories. And while I welcome these new resources and federal leadership bringing provincial and territorial and municipal governments to the table, it's essential that there are clear guidelines on what constitutes a human rights-based approach to encampments. And as this funding is being rolled out, there's a need for transparency and accountability on how the money is spent and what the outcomes is producing. So in the same time, since the launch, in the time since my launch, I continue to monitor and follow up on the recommendations by engaging with duty bearers from federal, provincial, and territorial and municipal governments, as well as Indigenous leadership, and local advocates and provincial and territorial human rights commissions. And in the last year, we developed resources to support governments to take a human rights-based approach to encampments. We published a fact sheet for provinces and territories and a fact sheet for municipalities to highlight my recommendations that are most applicable to them. We also worked with legal scholars to provide a summary of the legal obligations related to encampments and the most recent jurisprudence across the country. And this report provides a legal evidence base to understand how encampments should be treated by law in Canada. And just last week, we released an additional guidance targeted to governments on how to take a human rights-based approach. This fact sheet outlines 8 principles to guide meaningful engagement with people with lived experience in encampments. And as I said during my opening statements, meaningful engagement is key to the human rights-based approach, and it is critical to finding lasting solutions. So it's our hope that these fact sheets are particularly useful for municipal governments who are most often on the front lines when it comes to encampments responses. We know there are municipalities who want to do this well. They are well intended, but it's just, they're not sure how to do it. So it's not just an issue of releasing the report and saying, we're done. It's continuing to build tools to help governments and the public to understand what human right to housing means in action, because they can't just be nice words. So, more than a year after the final report on encampments, I believe that more duty bearers than ever are aware of their human rights obligations when it comes to encampments. And, there's lots of examples that I'd like to cite, but I know there's some other questions, and unfortunately I've got a hard stop at 2:00. So maybe, thank you so much for the question.
Well, it's certainly something that affects every place all across Canada. So your comments are truly appreciated on that and your work on that. Our other question, and you did touch on this briefly during your your talk as well, but Toronto sent an article on the financialization of housing that while it focused on Toronto, these large corporations operate on a national level. Researchers say their findings support policy recommendations from community groups for solutions that involve regulating rental housing, expanding tenant protections, and building more social housing in an effort to support tenants and housing equality, regardless of the landlord type. Also a comment that financial landlords should not be able to access support from CMHC or Canada's National Housing Strategy. So they would appreciate your comments on that particular topic.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing the article. My first request to the National Housing Council to form a review panel was focused on the financialization of purpose-built rental housing, the impacts on racialized communities and long-term care. And Dr. Martine August was the lead researcher who worked with my team to provide the research on which this request was based. So as a result of this research, the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skilled and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, we call it HUMA, they initiated a study into the practice of financialization of Canada. And I spoke before the Finance Committee on this topic as well. And as I said, I requested the National Housing Council to examine the financialization of purpose-built rental with a public review panel. So financialization of housing, for those who aren't aware, refers to the growing role of financial firms such as private equity, pension funds, and real estate investment trusts, we call them REITs, in the housing markets. And these firms, they acquire, operate, and develop housing as an investment strategy with the aim to maximize returns for their shareholders. So housing becomes a commodity in this case rather than a place to live for everyone in the community. And the report that my office commissioned shows that financialization is having a negative impact on the human right to adequate housing in Canada, including unaffordable rent increases, worsening conditions, a rise in evictions in rental housing, and a higher rate of morbidity and mortality in long-term care. So these trends are especially affecting the right to housing for National Housing Strategy priority groups, including Black and racialized communities, low-income tenants, seniors, and people with disabilities. So this issue is not only a problem in urban centers, but also in rural areas where there's a risk that these financial actors gain a monopoly on the rental market. And I've advocated for policies such as vacancy control, substantially increasing non-market housing solutions, and stronger protections for tenants. I've advocated for the federal government to follow through on its commitments on a renter's bill of rights put forth in last year's budget. And the Renters' Bill of Rights, it would be developed and implemented in partnership with provinces and territories, and it would protect renters from unfair practices like rent-evictions, maybe, and hopefully make leases simpler and increase, the transparency over the price of the units. What this really needs to do is just remove the incentive for these practices. If it's not profitable, then these practices would stop. In BC, they've adopted some tax and other measures to curb financialization, and to curb rent evictions. Landlords there need to prove that the unit upgrades are substantial and not just cosmetic. There's been some positive shifts from the Prime Minister's housing plan in terms of non-market housing, including a rental protection fund modeled on the BC's fund. And this allows the community housing sector to acquire rental apartment buildings to preserve affordability of rents over the long term. But there's still gaps remaining on the tenant protection side to protect them from a displacement from the renovation or evictions and abuse of fixed-term leases. And the bottom line is that we do need human rights responses to curb the financialization in Canada. there are excellent findings already available from the review panel on this issue and from the HUMA study and from our research. It's important that the government continues to act on this issue, and we can't let them forget. Because as we circle around, even lead the next steps for people in encampments, and I mentioned this during my opening remarks, if the affordability is not there, we're going to have more people experiencing housing precarity. And affordability can't be measured just on average income in large cities.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question,
Okay.
if I can here. And it's regarding the large rural and northern areas that we have in Canada. And they already have so much precarious housing up there. And now with the wildfires impacting tens of thousands of evacuees in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, many of those homes have been lost. And what are they going home to? Like right now, we have people who've been evacuated going home. And I don't know, how do we advocate for this? What do we do to help what's going on up there? Because it's right now, we don't even know, but people have lost, where 10 people were living in one house and now they have no house. And they're sent home to what? Could you, I'm sorry, it's a difficult question to address at this time, but it's certainly topmost on our minds out here for sure. Thank you.
I as much as I want to try to focus on the opportunities that could come out of this to recreate housing infrastructure that is climate resilient, that is that is going to meet the real needs of the community and really meet the definition of adequate housing under the, housing as a human right, that's culturally appropriate, that has adequate services for people, that is accessible. Because we heard so much, especially when we were in Inuit regions, how housing is just not even accessible for
Right.
people with disabilities. But, the sobering part is that's great. It takes decades to build that infrastructure. It takes years to build the housing. And as you said, the housing that was already there is just so inadequate. What's going to happen to these people in the meantime? I think, it's not just the current fires. I know that Peguis community in Manitoba was displaced due to flooding years ago, and they were displaced directly into homelessness in Winnipeg, and most of those people never got to go home. And so we have to talk about this. We have to make sure that government does this right, that people aren't just left to languish, that it's treated as the emergency that it is, but then after that, it has to be treated as something that is long-term and urgently addressed. Because Canada's really good at Band-Aids, really good at emergencies. And emergencies usually is targeted at, everyone. And where Canada fails grossly is really focusing all resources as a matter of urgency to the people that need it the most over the long term. And it's that long-term change, so putting people in hotels, sure, we can do that. We can make sure they get a little bit of support, but after that, it's what comes next is also just as important. So together, we need to continue to talk about this. We need proper engagement with the people of lived experience and Indigenous governments to really lead the way. And we need to be shoulder to shoulder with them to amplify their voices because they know what's best for their people. Most of them have a great vision of what they would like in terms of infrastructure and housing and services for their people in their communities and off their communities. And we need to be there to hold governments to account and make sure there's a time frame and there's transparency, there's data, so that we could do some monitoring, including consistent definitions. So that's where I'm trying to focus on, but it's hard.
It's a big job, and
is.
thank you for that. Well, unfortunately, our time for questions during this presentation has expired, but Ms. Houle's office has compiled that list of resources, and they'll be forwarded to each of the registrants today. To be hoped that perusing them will answer some of your questions, but again, as she said, contact her office whenever you need to. Sheila Pepper, our Education Fund board member, is pleased to offer our formal thanks to you, Ms. Houle. Sheila.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's been an amazing history hearing about all of your activities in the short time you have been the advocate, Marie-Josée. I'm in Vancouver half the time, so I've heard and met you there, and it's just amazing. Thank you so much. One of my questions would have been about the insurance coverage and how this can possibly happen with the people who have been evicted and renovated and so on. But the human rights commitment of the federal government is certainly what we're expecting them to live up to. The human rights strategy, the national human rights strategy of 2019, how can we push further? You have given us many ways to suggest that we can go further, and many resources that we can follow up on. We certainly need more of the gendered connection, the protection of families, the discrimination and harassment that you've mentioned, and particularly the financialization of housing in many urban areas in particular, and certainly Toronto and Vancouver are right up there. The open, peaceful, supportive, and healing is so important for us to consider, that is what we're looking for, and not having to be constantly worrying about being out of housing and having to go to shelters. Certainly leaving a housing situation under conditions of abuse and harassment is very scary for people, particularly if there aren't the supportive shelters and alternatives. And in some areas, they're doing reasonably well in this, and in other areas of the country, it's very difficult. And certainly in the north, we found that there are fewer resources and fewer ways to deal with this. The loss of lands and housing security, of course, in many areas of Aboriginal lands, and this is very scary as well. Most emergency centers don't support two-spirit, gendered, specific, diverse people, trans, and the landlords can discriminate. And we want to try to support landlords as well, because there are a number of small property landlords that are trying very hard to live up to this, but it's the large ones that are the biggest problem. Certainly the families can work on, we can all work on pressing our MPs, our MPPs, MLAs, and city councillors, several of which we've already done, but we have to keep pushing, especially for the new ones, to help educate them and tell them what has been done if they haven't been able to research it for themselves. So if we could all make appointments with these people who represent us, and not just nice words, as you have said, but action. And we've been saying the nice words and the recommendations and the resolutions and so on for decades in our councils of women, as you know. And so we just need these to come to fruition at some point. Thank you so much. It's been just a wonderful overview and review of everything that has been done and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila. And
Thank
thank you,
you.
Ms. Houle, for sharing your energy, purpose, and dedication to defining the causes of and finding solutions to the complex societal issues of homelessness. Your recent invitation to those lived with experience and the organizations that support them to share their stories and perspectives is reminiscent of an African proverb related to the British feminist author, Dr. Jessica Taylor, who wrote, "Until the lion learns how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter." As we understand this truth, we can more fully appreciate that so many of our social narratives are controlled by our hunters. And as she also said in her book, Why Women Are Blamed for Everything, we will, indeed we must, do better to empower our women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people to share their stories of trauma, of abuse, pain, and turmoil, along with their hopes, dreams, and ideas. We're truly grateful to you for leading this way in this particular cause and reminding us of the human face of homelessness, its impact, and the importance of our continued advocacy. In closing this presentation on behalf of the Education Board, I extend special thanks to you, Penny Rankin, NCWC President, Stephanie Magnum, NCWC First Vice President, for hosting our program. We also thank and sincerely appreciate each of you for sharing your time and thoughts with us today, like-minded men and women who are dedicated to working together to improve the quality of life for women, families, communities, and the whole of society. So thank you, and until we meet again, take care of yourselves as you take care of others. Thank you.